In a beautiful green jungle filled with tall trees and colorful birds, there lived a tiny ant named Andy. Andy was very small, but he was smart, kind, and brave. He lived happily with his ant family near a sparkling river deep inside the jungle. Not far away lived a huge elephant named Elliot. Elliot was the biggest animal in the jungle. His giant footsteps shook the ground, and his loud trumpet could be heard from very far away. But Elliot had one bad habit. He was very proud of his size and strength. Every day he would stand near the river and loudly say, "I am the strongest animal in the jungle. Nobody is bigger or more powerful than me." One sunny morning, Elliot walked carelessly through the jungle. As he passed by Andy's anthill, his giant foot almost crushed it. Dirt fell everywhere, and the tiny ants ran around in fear. Andy quickly climbed onto a small rock and shouted, "Please be careful, Mr. Elliot. You nearly destroyed our home." Elliot looked down at the tiny ant and laughed loudly. "Ha ha! You are so tiny I can barely see you. Why should I worry about little ants?" Andy felt hurt, but he stayed calm. "Being small does not mean being useless," Andy replied bravely. Elliot chuckled and sprayed water from his trunk. "What can someone as tiny as you possibly do?" he asked proudly. Andy looked up confidently and said, "Even the smallest creature can help others in ways you cannot imagine." But Elliot ignored him and proudly walked away. A few days later, the weather in the jungle became very hot and dry. The river slowly began shrinking, and many animals struggled to find water. Then, one afternoon, dark clouds suddenly filled the sky. Thunder roared loudly, and a terrible storm began. Heavy rain poured from the clouds, and strong winds shook the trees. The frightened animals rushed to find shelter. Elliot tried to walk through the muddy jungle, but suddenly his giant foot slipped into a hidden swamp. Crash! Elliot fell deep into the muddy swamp. He struggled with all his strength, but the more he moved, the deeper he sank. Help! Elliot cried loudly. "Somebody please help me." The monkeys tried pulling vines toward him, but they were too weak. The buffaloes pushed with all their strength, but Elliot was too heavy. Rain continued pouring from the sky. Soon, many animals became scared and slowly left the area. Only Andy the ant stayed nearby. Elliot looked sadly at the tiny ant and said, "You should leave too. Someone as small as you cannot help me." But Andy shook his head. "No friend should ever be left alone," he said kindly. Elliot felt surprised because nobody had ever called him a friend before. Andy quickly ran back to the anthill and gathered hundreds of ants. The ants marched through the rain like tiny soldiers. Andy shouted instructions loudly. "Bring strong vines. Gather sticks and leaves. We must work together." The ants worked quickly. Soon the monkeys joined them. Deer carried branches, and parrots flew overhead, helping everyone. Together, the animals built a strong path around the swamp. Then Andy shouted to Elliot, "Stop struggling. Stay calm and follow our directions." Elliot listened carefully. Slowly, step by step, the animals pulled while Elliot climbed forward through the mud. Finally, with one huge effort, splash! Elliot escaped safely from the swamp. All the animals cheered happily. The tiny ants saved the giant elephant. The parrots shouted excitedly. Elliot looked down at Andy with tears in his eyes. "I was wrong," Elliot said softly. "I thought size was everything. But today you showed me that kindness, wisdom, and teamwork are far more important." Andy smiled warmly. "And you showed me that even the strongest sometimes need help," he replied. Andy and Elliot became the best of friends. Every evening, Andy would sit happily on Elliot's giant head while they watched the sunset beside the river together. One day, some young elephants visited the jungle and asked Elliot, "How did you become so wise?" Elliot smiled proudly and pointed toward tiny Andy. "My greatest teacher was the smallest creature in the jungle," he said. The young elephants looked shocked. "That tiny ant?" they asked. "Yes," Elliot replied. "He taught me that courage is not measured by size." Years later, another terrible storm hit the jungle. But this time, all the animals worked together. Elliot used his strength to move fallen trees. The monkeys rescued birds, and Andy led thousands of ants to dig tunnels that drained floodwater away from homes. Because they worked together, the jungle stayed safe. That night, under the sparkling stars, all the animals gathered together to celebrate. Elliot raised his trunk proudly and said, "Big or small, every creature matters." The animals clapped and cheered happily. Andy smiled and added, "When we respect each other and work together, we can overcome any problem." And from that day forward, no animal in the jungle ever judged another by size again. The end.